for those of you, we thought this would be a really interesting and valuable thing to go through. One, because it's specific to the Berkshires. The project itself has a lot of different dimensions to it, a lot of different variables that went into it. But one of the key considerations of the project was, or one of, I guess, the core tenet was, how do we attract essentially millennials from New York to come to the Berkshires? It was through this vessel of the Berkshire Flyer, which was a train service. But the question at the crux of all of it was, how do we really position the region in a way that, really plays off of all those things that we were talking through with millennials in a way that will motivate them to come up here and make that somewhat long trip up. So this is from January 4th, 2019. It is not only, 2 years ago, but also 30 decades ago. Who knows what 2019 was like? Nobody remembers traveling. But in a day where trains still existed and we all rode them to fun places, this is what was put together. So I'm going to clip through some of this upfront of this document and kind of try to take you through the important stuff and context for it. But this was the actual presentation wherein we presented the two identities that we had created for the Berkshire Flyer, of which we're going to share one with you today. So again, what we'll always start off with what you're going to see, and what you're about to see is just some of the top level takeaways from looking at that millennial audience and how to attract them through the Berkshires, and then how you actually take all of that top level mind research and apply it to a more creative visual sphere. One of the things we did have the opportunity of doing with this is, we interviewed Senator Adam Hines for his point of view. There was a wealth of rich information that we received before even getting into this project, which really helped us turbocharge it forward. There were ridership surveys. There's involvement with Amtrak. There's a lot of hard work that went into this, and that is just reflected in the insights that were developed from this. But like what I was saying a little bit earlier with, yes, this is a train, but is it really a train that we're looking at right now? The bigger picture is, we need to improve people's desire to visit the region. That was really the crux of what was being talked about with this identity, which is tricky because you're trying to actually brand a method of transportation, but also build that desire to go to where the transportation actually travels to. So one of the stakeholders said, it will need to talk about why people want to come here before they will buy a ticket. And that is just the truth of what needed to be accomplished. What people were hoping for in terms of looking at success for the train, they wanted tourism growth in the short term, and then long term, it makes sense. Regional development would obviously stem from that. So that is, one of the top level goals there. I think what people were nervous about with the train was it had a somewhat steep price of entry, which was being subsidized. There was some insecurity around the duration of the trip. It's 4 to 4.5 hours. Won't people just drive? Something like that. It only, in theory, the train was to run from Friday through Sunday. So there's limited availability. There's a question of whether or not that would attract millennials. And then there were also some last mile limitations in terms of how you get from the station to your final destination, and then lack of awareness for the train service itself. But in addition to that, just like what we were talking about before of it being bigger than just a piece of transportation, there were perceptions with the region that we wanted to address from the beginning, because if you don't address these with what you ultimately come up with, then you'll wind up with a really nice looking train that no people will want to get onto, right? So some of the challenges that were related to the perception of the region were there's a lack of awareness of the newer regional offerings and destinations. There is this kind of vague sense of inaccessibility. Berkshires are too far away, too hard to get to. There were negative stereotypes, expensive, filled with old people. And then there was also this developing sense of wealth inequality in some areas. I had no idea that this paradise was also one of the poorest parts of the entire state. And a lot of these are Berkshire Flyer stakeholder quotes. And then a lot of the other quotes that you'll see throughout here is just desk research, going online, using the tools that we all have available to us, going through Yelp, going through Google reviews, going through forums, and really seeing what people are saying. They call it user-generated content. that just organically disseminates throughout the internet. So if those are the challenges, the opportunities that we saw for this and were a total game changer, were just huge numbers for people being excited for a service. 99% of respondents to a Berkshire Flyer ridership survey said they were interested in it. 94% said they would use it. Amtrak was predicting a much higher ridership than average, 2,600 one-way trips, which is a really strong number. And then when a survey was sent out to Metro New York, 55% of respondents said they were interested in it and would visit the cultural attractions in the Berkshires if it were made available. So it had a lot of really good momentum behind it. And then we also found that some of those initial hesitations, the things that people were worried about, were actually very competitive about the train, right? People were worried that it might take too long. But when you compare the Berkshire Flyer service 4 to 4.5 hours with something like hopping on a Greyhound, it was actually a lot faster. And it's worth remembering, since we were looking at this through the millennial audience, that in New York, most millennials don't have their own cars, and you're not going to Uber up to the Berkshires. So it's actually a very competitive way to move forward. And the reason this was important to establish is because it took some of the pressure off of that speed component and that being a downside and turned it into an upside and something that we could actually play to the advantage of the service. Another thing we identified through that millennial audience lens is that there is this changing perception in terms of travel. And so we looked at this company called Getaway. And this is kind of mind-blowing now, because now that we've all lived through COVID, something like this is even more attractive. But Getaway positioned itself as close enough for a last-minute escape, far enough to disconnect. And I think that's something a lot of people connected with, the ability of leaving New York City and going to the Berkshires. It's close enough for a last-minute decision to hop on a train Friday night, but far enough away to disconnect and feel like you're in a totally different world, which we thought could be a really competitive thing for the Flyer. And then obviously you're all very aware of all of the buzz that's just been growing and growing and growing over a long period of time for the Berkshires. So that's something huge just to consider throughout this. So I've already alluded to millennials and that being a big consideration for this. Let's talk about, how do we take that equation that Kirsten was talking about through the end product work, and how do you, get behind that and kind of look at millennials and say, how do I communicate with this very specific group of people? To appeal to new audiences, the Berkshires needs to feel authentic, fresh, and diverse. Again, the primary audience we were going for here were generally younger people who are less familiar with the area. They need to be attracted to the area, though, and whatever mark we come up with should drive them and generate buzz and interest.
And actually, I think the thing that Robert on that last slide that also mentioned is that a lot of times when you are targeting a millennial, you have other audiences that you want to make sure you don't alienate them as well. And so that's why this is like sort of a gray space, right? But make sure that when you are doing something targeted to millennials, that you haven't inadvertently alienated another audience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which is why if you stick to the core tenets of that equation, you will be in a stronger place, because many people are similar to that. So in terms of that target weekend tourist, younger people, primarily mid to late millennials, 27 to 47 years old, that trickles into Gen X, household income of 100K plus, car-free, New York metro area. What are some key characteristics in this audience, and how can the Berkshire Flyer attract them? And this is what you should pay attention to. I want to reiterate, yes, we had a wealth of really amazing research for all of this, right? We had ridership surveys. We were able to talk to Senator Adam Hines. Like, there's all that amazing stuff. And then moving forward, we were able to do the same things you were able to do. We never went down to New York to actually poll people on the street. We went and we did desk research, and we looked at what was being generated online and what we could learn from it in terms of how millennials, and how any audience, but how millennials specifically, could tie into the Berkshires and feel motivated, not just to go there, but to go there via this train. The first thing we found was that millennials are curious adventurers and trendsetters. They're adventurous, intrepid, and adopt new technologies, destinations, and experiences earlier than older travelers, right? And that's from USA Today, again, desk research. Forbes said, we consider ourselves citizens of the world and we have an enthusiastic desire to immerse ourselves in another place and return rejuvenated, inspired, and ready for our next adventure. So all of a sudden, adventurers and trendsetters is incredibly important to however we position this, right? Because we see that as a core tenet of our audience. Another thing we found was that they avoid mainstream to find authentic experiences. And this is an incredibly exciting thing to find because all of a sudden your disadvantage of not being well known becomes your competitive advantage over other areas. So yeah, everybody else has heard of the Hudson region for going there from New York City, but the Berkshires, which is farther out, yeah, you've heard about it, but you don't necessarily know the specific places that you can bring back and brag about, right? So if you're avoiding the mainstream to find authentic experiences, it means that the Berkshires has an inherent advantage. So millennials want to travel in a way that is authentic and connects them to the people around them. They're hungry for an experience unlike what they or their friends have had before, something authentic. They're also attracted by city caliber culture and beautiful natural settings, which might be written about the Berkshires if you've been here before, but that is literally the Berkshires, right? They choose to come for city amenities with the ease of the country. They're known for placing a high emphasis on being unique, and a major part of that is growing their identity through culturally rich experiences and exploration of the unknown. So again, this is similar to the previous insight that we were talking about, but a lot of how millennials share and express themselves is by thinking of themselves almost as micro influencers. Okay, so if you are on Instagram and you have 400 followers or even 100 followers, you are a micro influencer to that group of people. So if you're able to go somewhere like the Berkshires and take home with you a photo that shows a place that none of those other people have seen, you are suddenly an influencer sharing, I don't know, Jacob's Pillow with this group of people who are seeing it for the first time. And that builds your social equity and also builds the region's equity because more people want to go and see that and go take a picture of it and go experience it themselves for their own circle of friends, right? Oh, look, they desire to share their experiences. Jump the gun on this one, but 61% of millennials are influenced to travel to a destination by its potential for Instagram-friendly snaps, right? That's exactly what I was just saying. They go for the bragging rights of being the first in their circle. So when you summarize these, it feels like a roadmap, right? When you add all these trends together, they're curious adventurers and trendsetters. They avoid the mainstream to find authentic experiences. They're attracted by city caliber culture and beautiful natural settings, and they share their experiences. It feels all of a sudden much more precise and attainable for the Berkshires, right? It no longer feels like, how are we going to attract millennials who are into technology and grew up with the internet? It suddenly feels like this is a specific path that we can actually utilize and speak to still be ourselves, but still know how to really engage millennials and get them to engage back with us. So in terms of how we use that audience data and that roadmap almost to inform something like a logo or a mark, one of the ways we do this is we start off by looking at what everybody involved in the project wanted this logo to look like. So these are keywords from people who worked on the actual Berkshire Flyer task force. These are some of the vocabulary they used. Sophisticated, trendy, weird, outdoorsy, authentic, and unexpected. So that's where they wanted the logo to go. But then we said, okay, what would happen if we looked at those words through the lens of the experiences that are actually engaging your audience, right? They wouldn't say sophisticated, they would say experiential. Trendy is new. Weird, they wouldn't really say weird, they'd say original. Rather than outdoorsy, they might say adventurous. Authentic is genuine. You need to be genuine to yourself. And then unexpected, this is fresh. This is new to me, right? This is going to be new to my social following. And then finally, we expanded those image attributes into what we could do with the actual logo itself. So rather than experiential, it's artful, it's modern, it's abstract, it's story-driven, it's unique, and it's bold. So those became some of the pillars that could uphold a visual identity based entirely from, what the audience was looking for, what the Berkshires could offer, and then what we could do together as a visual identity. So like we said, initially there were two. We're going to go ahead and share the one that moved forward. And one thing to keep in mind is, even though we were just talking about brand, this is a challenging exercise because you're not just branding a train, you're branding a region. You're talking about how to attract people to that place through the train. It's worth noting that no matter what you're doing, you need to look around yourself to see what other people are doing, and that's going to help you be yourself even more than some other exercises, right? So when you were to look around other train services in the region, even like the Cape Flyer, which arguably has a very similar role to something like the Berkshire Flyer, you can see that their identities, their logos are all very similar. They're very train focused. They feel centered in reality. They're picturesque, but there's not necessarily a sense of culture as much as there's a sense of place and going from one place to another. So what we said is like, okay, that's nice and that works really well for them, but let's be a little bit more disruptive because that's what the Berkshires are known for. They're known for the culture. So let's make sure that culture is at the center of whatever mark we develop. So instead of looking at the mountains themselves, we looked at the cultural spaces in the Berkshires that really define itself. And so we said, okay, this is going to be our mark of success, that whatever we come up with for a visual identity to attract these millennials, that it is going to work with all of the places that already exist in the Berkshires, and we'll keep them coming back and posting to Instagram and whatever social channels they're subscribing to.
Right. So now we're getting into translating all of that information. And we've looked at all this millennial data, and we've looked at all the success that we need to accomplish for this identity. We've also put it through the filter of BRIGADE, which is we believe in one-of-a-kind identities, total consistency, and making sure that every touch point is relevant, right? So here we go, summing it all together. We need to make sure that this is reflective of the story that you need to tell. We need to make sure that the 5 principles of good logo design, which are just sort of like true, the things that you need to do when you create a logo. You need to make sure it's simple. You don't want it to be overly complicated, although we just saw some of that on the previous page. You want it to be memorable. You don't want it to just blend in, which you saw a little bit on that previous page, right? Not the one with the competitors, but all the trains that we were looking at, right? You want it to be timeless. You don't want to have this be something you're going to hate in a couple of years or that doesn't feel relevant in a couple of years. You need it to be versatile. And that's really put a lot more pressure on identity design over the last few years because of the amount of digital spaces, because of the amount of adaptation a logo needs to take on. Doesn't just live on a business card anymore. And it needs to be appropriate. And that's pretty straightforward, right? We also need to consider the technical usage aspects of good logo and identity design. We definitely dug into the digital use of this because we were really looking at the millennial audience. So really making sure that we've considered the technical usage of this. How is this going to adapt? How is this going to change? How does this work tiny? How does this work big? How does this work in sharing the stage with other identities? And then how can you leverage your identity to have a larger impact? And that was particularly something we thought about in this case. These guys had a limited budget and it needed to work, right? So how do we take that investment and make sure that this is bigger than just a logo, right? It has more impact. There are new distilleries, breweries, and farm-to-table restaurants. It's such a movement. People are doing this stuff because it makes them feel good, and feeling good is the new rich, right?
So we called this the Berkshire Movement, inspired by that quote. And we said this direction seeks to brand the Berkshire Flyer as a catalyst of influence and culture. It leverages a mark that is always changing and moving forward, speaking to the momentum of the region and the train itself. Examples of the campaign rally behind the idea that the area is in the midst of a movement to entice an audience that values being able to impact things and experience something raw, new, and authentic. Again, taking those audience insights that you can develop and applying them to what you ultimately create.
This is what we call a responsive logo. And another great example of this is Disney. And no matter where you are, whether you're seeing it in its full form, like the Google mark here, or you're just seeing the ellipses, the ability to adapt and expand and contract and make sure that you're still on brand has become increasingly important. And this is a great example of it. So we're considering that, right? We're considering the fact that this is going to need to grow and shrink. Mm-hmm. We're also looking at other trends that we're seeing, which is people using their marks in their advertising campaigns, right? This is an Airbnb campaign where they've also, there's a whole other piece of this with audience participation, but really taking their mark and making it a hook for a campaign, right? So, you know, giving it that ability for people to build on it and be a part of it, right? So that's the other thing that we were thinking of, is how can we make this much more than just a logo?
Mm-hmm. And again, just being mindful of the fact that we're trying to attract a millennial audience. We're looking at Google, that's technology, Airbnb, that's technology linked to location. So making sure that we're learning from them and how they're building interest with their own consumers as well when we jump into this.
Mm-hmm. So here's our mark, right? We're gonna deconstruct it for you so you can see how we got here. But you're definitely looking at a B. We're looking at all the different parts of the Berkshires. We were considering the trees, and you can see them translating over there into that green triangle. The fresh air, the skies, the open sky, right? That you get only in the Berkshires where you can actually see the stars. The mountains that have come in there, right? That we've put in the upper right for people who hike. Warmth, you know, the being outside, the sunrise, the sunset, the piece of things that you sort of don't appreciate when you're in the city. Adventure, going for a hike, going for a climbing a tree adventure park. And then the movement piece, the train, the tracks, the moving forward piece of it. And also there's a whole level of texture we've added in here too, because it has a very tactile, hands-on experience. Right? So looking at the shapes that we went to, but also the color palette, and how do we make sure this is a palette that feels both earthy and that sun component and the trees and the sky and the train tracks, and coming up with a palette that feels very kind of true to the experience. And then we looked at that sort of responsive component of it, right? In its full entirety over on the left that we could even build on. It has this very sort of modular feel to it. You see the bee, you see the movement, you see the adventure. What happens when we pull it down and we make it even smaller? It's just a bee, right? Now it can get all the way down to a tiny little mark that we can see living on a ticket or living with another logo if it needs to. Right? So that whole sort of fluid identity. And here it is, you know, living with other brands and where other people are going to visit while they've taken the Berkshire flyer out here. You know, I think importantly then it was we start to look at, okay, how do you bring identities to life? You do it through swag, you do it through non-traditional things, badges of honor people can take back to New York and show their friends, or someone can say, oh, where'd you get that? You know, those curiosity pieces, those discovery pieces that people want to kind of brag about become increasingly important. And there's no formula to this. I mean, it's like use your gut on some of this stuff. You know, it's like, what would people like to have? Is your money better spent on a bunch of bags, or is it better spent on a billboard? You know, you have to consider that, right? Showing it even in its simplest one color form still has the same vibe as when you have a 4-color investment that you can make in it, or a digital animation piece. Right, that's it really boiled down to its simplest form, looking at it living on the side of a train with Amtrak or on a ticket.
And it's important you think this way too, because if you create something which won't be able to be, if you're not going to be able to put it everywhere that you are with integrity, then you're not going to come off as authentic. You're going to come off as compromised or as something that's a little bit disingenuous in certain places, right? You want to make sure that your weakest touch point, the place that's the hardest for you, is still paid off at your best touch points, and vice versa, right?
Mm-hmm. And then we said, well, okay, well, what if it was awesome that every time you came out to the Berkshires, or you came out a couple times a year, there was something a little to discover about it. So what if we looked at a different palette for this logo in different seasons, right? what if we built on the experiences people come for, whether it is the summertime or the skiing or the leaf peeping? And what if we had fun with this? And so when you're on, the Berkshire Flyer and there's a beer car with local beer that you're drinking it out of cups that change, and there's a conversation point here, and there's something for you to capture on your phone, like how cool is this? They changed it for this season, right? Just
right, and this is almost like a gate to engagement too, because this is perfect for the person who's come to the Berkshires. They've discovered it, they've loved it, but like they don't have their next trip planned, But you see something like this, and it reminds you, I've not seen that in the summer. I've not been there in the fall to go be a leaf peeper that clogs up all the roads for all of us. You know what I mean? It's like it reminds you to come back and re-engage. And for other people who may have heard you talk about the Berkshires, seeing this evolving evolution of this identity will keep reminding you of like, oh yeah, there is stuff that I haven't discovered there. I want to go there. Again, playing off of that millennial audience and knowing what makes them tick, right?
And we did this in 2019. So if we went back and did this again, there probably would have been a QR code on here, and it would have been like cool things to do in the Berkshires during this season. There would have been an additional layer of engagement to it. The other thought with this is like blow this into a wall mural, do something unexpected, take the parts of this and have some fun with it and create something that gets people talking.
Mm-hmm. And this is great. I mean, it's just the whole idea of going from the city into the mountains. It's just, it really works off of the very specific route that the Berkshire Flyer itself would have.
And again, us thinking about the legs of this being an identity, not so just much a logo, but how could we turn this into posters? And, how could you put up some inexpensive ways to market this that had sort of that artful impact? Mm-hmm.
And it's also worth mentioning that even if you don't have, this is a mock-up of out of home, right? It's like this is an ad buy for posters. Even if you don't have the funds to go, buy a bunch of posters and put them around town, you can have these in your own retail space. You can have them on your website. You can post them to Instagram. It's all about curating that environment, whatever environment you allow yourself to define for yourself. So like, this isn't, these are definitely aspirational mock-ups, but just keep in mind that even with a small budget, a consistent identity like this can raise a lot of ships for you,
Right. Actually, these probably should have been cooler, those t-shirts, looking at them now. But we were thinking of, sorry. But some sort of t-shirts that people could collect and wear as well, as going down to the next one, which was just like sticker giveaways people could put on their laptops, or just like this cool pin where someone might say, what's that? I think we were like, that's what's so interesting about this is like, don't hammer the logo. Don't put the type all over it. Let people say, what's that? Right. That's got a ton of power to it. And also looking at it through the lens of digital, obviously, because that was our audience. How could we switch out color palettes? How could we have a little, an app where you could check the schedules and things like that, and also have it embrace that seasonal changes, reskins per, quarterly or something.
Yeah, it'd be great if on your phone, your icon itself was reminding you that it's fall in the Berkshires, like that would be spectacular.
Yeah. And how to do some sort of print ad if you needed to do it as well. Again, the flexibility and modularity of an identity like this. Right. Yeah. Right from the forest to the city. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So you've almost made it to the end of us talking, of which I'm sure we can talk. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to take a minute and just take that equation from the very beginning of our long-winded talking, and then kind of show you behind the scenes how it's all done, top level, how other brands do it. And now we're going to show you very, very quickly and succinctly how that equation has been applied to everything you just saw, right? Mm-hmm. So be unique. That means a purposeful narrative, a thoughtful aesthetic, build a distinctive, one-of-a-kind identity and brand, right? You can see that exactly here with the Berkshire Flyer, comparing it to the competitive. It is radically different. It's much more cultural. That seasonal breakout, definitely a purposeful narrative, definitely thoughtful. Be authentic for millennials. That means real, consistent, true to yourself. We know that means to have a consistent look, voice, and set of values. it's not just about making sure that you are, representing yourself with integrity at every touch point. It's also about making sure that that touch point is informed by your actual story. On this mock-up of a brand book, it's called The Logic Behind the Logo. And it's the Berkshires, the trees, the fresh air, the mountains, the warmth, the adventure, the movement, right? Just make sure that that story is really paid off. And then finally, be shareable. That means memorable, brag-worthy, and social friendly. Engage your audience at every relevant touch point in a way that's true to your brand. And, we just went through this, but it's the idea of, making a coffee cup more special and making sure that your digital app itself is re-enticing people to come back to the area itself. So there we have it.